Today we are very, very happy to welcome Dr. Vera Bühlmann. I believe her work is well known not only in Vienna, where she is the director of the Department of Architectural Theory and Philosophy of Techniques at the Technical University. She is one of the leading theorists on the digital in general, computational discourses and technology in particular. Together with Ludger Höverstadt, she co-founded and directs the Laboratory for Applied Virtuality at the Architectural Department at the ETH Zurich, which was founded in 2010, and she co-edits the Applied Virtuality book series, a collection of books crucial to the current digital discourses. And I believe it shows her attitude towards theory, and in this case, theory is active thought, an approach we have encountered before in the lecture series. And I want to continue with a quote by Wittgenstein, who says, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And I chose this quote just to kind of set the territory, which I believe that Vera Bühlmann shares, coming from the literal and linguistics. So again, another point of departure in comparison to the guests so far. And I think what she is proposing as a theorist, or actually just doing it, is what she calls non-territorial thinking. Hence her affinity and interest toward abstraction and substitution, which I think she finds in mathematics. So the main vectors of Vera Bühlmann's work revolve around the philosophy and history of semiotics and mathematics, and the role of technology in architectural theory. So her work is driven by an interest in a better understanding of a probabilistic perspective on data and code as an altered setup for a quantum semiotics of products as articles and articulations. Her main philosopher of interest is Michel Serres, and she's just finishing or publishing, or maybe it just got out already, a book called Information and Mathematics in the Philosophy of Michel Serres. So today, though, she will take us on a journey through history of science in connection to mathematics, through the absurd and the harmonic, through ciphers and black boxes, through matter as understood in quantum physics, in order to ground her thoughts on the time-space complex, or what she calls encrypted spatialities. And without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Vera Bühlmann.
Thank you so much for this very kind and übertrieben introduction. I don't think many people actually have ever heard of the books that we published. We did publish a lot, but it is not quite temporal, because we always presuppose that language and mathematics are not really categorically separate things. So one of the main ideas that is the sound fine like this? Yeah. One of the main ideas that you should maybe keep in mind when I'm speaking is that there is an underlying idea that in mathematics we are speaking, and in speaking we are thinking abstractly at the same time. So thought and language is very much an active thing. That's what I would like to not give away. But how to address this kind of activity, that is a complicated thing. And the proposals I would like to speak about tonight with the cornucopian instruments and the capital concepts specifically, tries to make proposals of how we could maybe find new ways of addressing this categorical distinction that in language we are always reflective and demonstrative and in a kind of an unparticipatory relation to what we are dealing with, while in another kind of practice that would be opposed to theory, we would be less reflective, less distanced and more involved. I think this is not really a framework that is so interesting anymore today to pursue. Now it doesn't work. are all very much used already of seeing images from outer space of the Earth. That is significant enough. But there is something very significant as well about thinking that the Earth rises from this perspective. So with the Earth rise, we are in a position that somehow presupposes a cyclicity, a circularity, no? A morning and a night, an evening and a morning again. And it is a kind of a sentiment and an interest, a different interest in time that I feel becomes present. Maybe it's just because I haven't been attentive to literature that much in the last 10 years, and it's starting again now. This was my original field. I did my master's in literature. There seems to be a kind of a boredom with regards to the structuralist, post-structuralist, and also any kind of composed narrative time. In a linear sense, a composed narrative time. There seems to be an interesting interest in these ideas. So the volumes I put here together with this image of the Earth rises by a Viennese author, Philipp Weiss, quite a young author, and he wrote this compendium of what is it, 5 books or 6 books, for which it is significant that he not only wrote the texts as himself, he also invented the authors that writes the text. But of course he is the author of these authors. And it's a declared kind of a play with a pseudonym, and through that with authorship and also authority, that is very interesting. And the point of view that he starts from is, no, we are all am Weltrand sitzen die Menschen und lachen. So at the end of the world, people are sitting and laughing. No, and it's not a cynical statement, at least in the reading that I would like to apply to it. So I couple it with this idea that from outer space here, there is earthiness. So there is a kind of a daily time, and it is such a, if you want, agricultural, no, like a farming approach to morning and seasons and to a notion of time that is very much related to practice and to cultivation in a very material sense, but from outer space, not just around the Earth, but from outer space, that I want to address with a term that isn't very popular anymore, but it has been for many centuries until the 16th, 17th century, actually, one of the core terms in natural philosophy, which is meteora. Meteora originally meant, that's also why I put the title, Architectura Meteora. So meteora originally meant what links the Earth to the heavens, so it is the climate in between. And it has been addressed, of course, with relation to the weather, so to recurring, to also sustainable, if you want, to climatic, to weather phenomena, to complex phenomena that are not directly graspable, but also not graspable. Yeah? So we can anticipate, we can find regularities, patterns, but they are not properly precise and not properly fuzzy. And this is the kind of the theoretical or the domain of abstraction, I would say, where I'm very much interested in. Another book that I find even more significant with regard to this question is a book that has been written already 15 years ago by Peter Handke, called The Loss of Images. Its translation in English doesn't translate this title. I think it's just a journey through the Sierra, through the desert, where it takes place. But what it actually addresses is a kind of a metaphysical and of course a psychic, so also a spiritual, but a metaphysical loss of images that relates to how we think or how we can relate to a capacity to imagine, so a kind of a power of imagination. And as a kind of a motto for the lecture that I would like to give, maybe I would start by reading this very short passage that captures very nicely what is at stake. He writes, "The loss of images is the most painful of losses. It means the loss of the world. It means there is no more seeing. It means one's perception slides off every possible constellation. It means there is no longer any constellation. We will have to live without the image for the time being. For the time being. But isn't precisely such a loss accompanied by energy, even if this energy is undirected for the time being. Cuerpo del mundo, body of the world, we the banished, full of passion. It is this interest that the absence, so if you want, where we are left after negating something. So the absence of something is an energetic state. That's what he tries to think. So he tries to think about images and a kind of an activity of images in a way that doesn't try to make the images represent something or even stand for something. The images are something. I will come back to the novel at the end of the lecture. This interest in a kind of, now it sounds very esoteric in a certain way, not materiality of light and images and ideas that are not somehow a matter of just subjective interpretation, but as a kind of a physical force. And I genuinely don't mean it in that way. Yeah. So if we think, without having any kind of a claim of an expertise in these fields of the natural sciences, but if we think about what in quantum physics we are dealing with, it is the physics of light. Now, in quantum physics, from a quantum physics perspective, everything at all, every flavor, every form of energy, is ultimately a kind of a spectrum cast through the white light of solar radiation. That's, I don't mean that poetic, I don't mean it dramatic, that is quite literally what electricity and what quantum physics is concerned with. So there is a physics of light. And what I'm interested in also in these newer approaches in philosophy, in theory, they're very diverse. They go by the name of new materialism. I'm very skeptical with, so as you, I'm very happy you said that. I really try to get completely disinterested in territoriality. So that is in itself not very attractive, but what is attractive about it is that they all try in different ways to somehow address another relation between energy or matter and form. And another relation which is constitutive for what we have with information. Because information in today's technology is it's a quantity. So it's a quantity, it can be counted. It's like number, it's like an energetic number. No? That's why it intervenes between matter and form, between energy and form. And there is an event which is quite significant. It happened this year. Well, it happened this year. This year was the main conference where decisions were taken. Just, I think about 1 month ago. I'm not entirely sure. It concerns the, see how the proper name is. It's the main institution that was founded in France after the French Revolution. It was the one institution which set up a relation between industrialization and modern science. And it's called the International Bureau for Weights and Measures. From its founding document, I just want to read 3 lines to tell you the scope of what that meant. Now, this is quite old in a way. We are very much used to standards with regard to measuring. But there is a phrase that is very significant. So they said, so with the Bureau of this standardization, gone were the confusing and the strife-provoking local definitions of acres, pints, bushels, gallons, and pounds. The new metric system would be a language based on the dimensions of the Earth itself. The dimensions of the Earth itself. As you probably all know, this kind of language was rooted in models that would represent the natural constants. No? So you would have, this is the model for the kilogram. It's a special one. I will try to tell you a little bit why. But you know, we have the meter, which has been abstracted from. There were actual physical artifacts originally that would represent and be the source for calibrating. No? So they would be the model that is the standard, the reference for a standard. And over the last 200 years, since they started with this, mathematics got more and more algebraic. This was the main thing in the 19th century. So algebra developed into a status that was then called universal. At the turn of the 20th century, they began to speak not anymore of symbolic algebra, but of universal algebra. And through that, what used to be called natural laws in classic physics was formulated in terms of laws of conservation. And this shift is very important because natural laws, they would be determinative. So there would be a causality and then there would be effects. That's the thinking related to it. But the laws of conservation, they address, like in thermodynamics, they address transformations of matter within conditions that can be to certain degrees controlled. So it's a very different formulation, and it changed, it made in principle the physical artifacts superfluous for organizing the references for the standards of measuring. But what remained was one peculiar artifact, and it concerns weight. It concerns the kilogram. And that's because within the system of modern physics, within Newton's system, the kilogram stands for gravity. And gravity was the one mythical force from which all the others were derived. Yeah? So Newton himself thought of gravity as the skin of God. So gravity remained mysterious, but from it, everything was sourced. So to actually symbolize gravity would make the systematicity arbitrary. And that is the discussion that this Bureau of the International Standards for Weight and Measuring were concerned with for the last 20 years, because there were new natural constants. No? Within in the 20th century, almost, I don't know, every 15 years, there was a new magnitude, the Planck constant. And there was the formalization of time with regards to the speed of light that could be measured. So there were more and more precise and less earthly with regard to the planet, so universal ways of formulating it, that this role of the system that the kilogram stands for, it cannot represent the quantum physical characterization of the measures that are needed to unify the sciences. So there is a book published by the PR, by the head of the PR department of this institute, which describes the conflict with regard to it. So the kilogram became a kind of a sacred object, and it was literally a sacred object. It was because the thing is, as a physical model, it would decompose. That's what this headline says here. No, so over time, the reference magnitude for a kilogram would actually get less. That's quite a scandal. So it's funny too, but it's also quite a scandal. So for a long time, what they did is they tried to keep it very sterile. So it was shut away. It could only be looked at every 10 or 7 years. And it had 7 clones. These clones were called the 7 witnesses. They are distributed across the nation states, so people would have to travel there to calibrate. So this is very Babylonian. It's like in Babylonian science, very interesting. But it has, of course, much larger implications, because it applies, it has implications that concern the unity of science. And this is what they are concerned with, because if the stability, without understanding how exactly, is not there anymore, people would lose trust in the objective role of science. So this has enormous political and social implications, of course, across a very, very, very high span of abstraction, but it is very clear that it does. From the early quote, we had this statement that the idea was that now, with this standards for measuring, we find a language that would be of the dimensions of the Earth itself. That's what they started with, and that's what I mean when I said, so they're not probably earthly dimensions anymore, but they become universal. It's like algebra in the 19th century. So the magnitudes are constituted in formulas that then allow to design artifacts to represent it, but they're not primarily measured. They are rendered measurable through inventing devices that measure them. So the language that they were looking for wasn't properly of the dimensions of the Earth, it was a universal language. And as a universal language, it picks up the Baroque theme of a mathesis universalis. No? So a universal language cannot really be physical. And that's what they are struggling with. It's a very interesting discourse. You see, this is from 17. Yes, this is from 17. But if you just Google the media, you find lots of things on that. I'm very surprised how much it is actually picked up, because it's truly a big thing what is happening. So the conference they had a few months ago was to decide how to proceed. It was actually to decide, should we now get rid of the physical model of the kilogram and go entirely for an algebraic, that means a crystalline, a symmetry-based artificial formulation, or is there another way to arrange it? And I think they decided in the end for a kind of a combination. I haven't studied the latest developments, but that's an interesting thing to pick up. And at its core is precisely this kind of nature of light as a materiality. And that's what I am interested in. Michel Serres, who indeed has been, for me, the most important philosopher for the last couple of years, but this is just after many others. I started to think with Charles Peirce. I didn't realize at that time that he was actually an algebraist. I learned to know about him through semiotics, but later it made a lot of sense why I was so fascinated, because he had a kind, in the 19th century, he had a kind of a metaphysics which said there is a continuity between mind and matter, and we can think about mind as very fast matter, and we can think about matter as super slow mind. And this kind of spectrality as an approach, this has been a very stable metaphor or a concept, a vehicle to think with for me. Michel Serres addresses this, for example, here with an interesting formulation, because he doesn't, that's why I like what he is saying. For him, this is not catastrophic. This is not a new world. This is not a transhumanism. This is not something on a moral scale, on a historical scale, so dramatic. No, it is quite a precise process. So that a substitution takes place. A substitution doesn't mean a replacement necessarily, or it doesn't mean a replacement of an original. It means a substitute for another substitute. Yeah? So it's a structuralist point of view. And he says a substitution takes place in which science eradicates language. And this explains our time. And science eradicating language takes away the fundamentalism of an understanding of language. Because eradicate literally means uproots. Yeah? So language becomes mobile. So language is no longer the idea that we can have an original language from which everything derives. This is also an idea that was very constitutive for the 19th century. It's not properly adequate to relate to these transformations with regard to language. That's what he is pointing attention to. And one of the consequences that with this I would like to connect it to the theme of the meteora, the Earth's rise. Not just the picture of the Earth from outer space, but the temporality that this brings with it. Michel Serres saying we recognize ideology by the use of calendars. So that will be important. So what is a calendar? How do we count time? How do we measure the forms through which we count time? So all of these things, they kind of expose what I call a secret scandal of modern science, which Bertrand Russell has actually formulated. And he surely did not affirm this scandal. He was very troubled by that. Mathematics may be defined as the subject in which we never know what we are talking about, nor whether what we are saying is true. So that's very unsettling, because in mathematics, the only domain where things just are right or not. So it's a kind of a decoupling of something being right from something being true, and from giving an indication of what it means, where we are placed through such a rightfulness. And what I would like to address as architectonic articulations relates to this domain where we are, if we think mathematically and have no clue what we're dealing with or where we are. And an idea that I'm trying to develop further, this is still in quite an early stage actually, so there's a lot of promise in it, and I'm not sure how much can be held by this idea. But I like to speak of the digital as a continent. It's a continent, not an island. Well, if continents are islands, that's a big discussion in itself. But it's important to make a difference, for example, to what Aurelia addresses as the archipelago and the islands. No? So the difference between the archipelago is the sea. The ocean is not the sea. The ocean is the river around the end of the world. So that's the original meaning of the ocean. So the ocean is larger than a sea. It is not really contained. And yet, of course, the oceans have a kind of a body. So what I would like to think is that this oceanic body would be information, because that information is no longer flooding us. Yeah? So the continents is surfacing within this information. This has, from a philosophical point of view, this has quite important implications, because it says knowledge and non-knowledge, they don't have a kind of an ecliptical relation to each other. So knowledge always consists within a notion of non-knowledge. But because of the notion of non-knowledge, knowledge can also change through time. Even mathematical knowledge can change through time. And this is a way, it's a kind of a time which is intensive. No, in mathematics, I don't just mean that through the centuries, I don't know, the idea of the imaginary unit was first addressed with Descartes, and then it changed its formulations and it got more and more and more and more precise. It's not just that. It doesn't just get more and more precise. It also gets more and more expansive in the place where it can be precise. It's like an irrational number for the Greeks was in a way the same as it is today, but with regard to how we know how to treat it, it is of course entirely not the same. So this is a kind of a relation to time that I refer to in terms of aging, of growing old. It's the same paradox in a way that we have with the self. No? So are we ourselves after 20 years? Yes and no. So it's a kind of a qualitative and intensive relation of time that can certainly no longer be understood in the same sense like this initial idea of the Bureau of Measurements. No, it's not the dimensions of the Earth. But what it produces, what thought like this produces, is an understanding of objects that determine the world. No? And they have dimensions of the world. So Michel Serres calls them world objects. And at its most abstract, he says a world object is an object that corresponds to one dimension of the world. A world object corresponds to one dimension of the world. And the dimensions it's like they explode, they fly away. Yeah? So we have, he calls the internet for space, he calls the atomic bomb for energy, nuclear waste for time. So it's like the dimensions that would hold together this space, which we call the global. The dimensions, they cast off. Yeah? So where are they going? They fly. So world objects are something very different. And it means that we can no longer remain within this idea of a Cartesian space where scales and dimensions are synonymous. So scales become independent from there also being dimensions. And these scales, that's the core idea of what I want to address in terms of cornucopian instrument. Now, a cornucopia, if you know, it's a spiral. It's a spiral out of which so much is coming out that it never ceases. So it's a kind of a miraculous, it's a mythic idea, of course, but it has to do with an understanding of scales in a way that we are no longer used very much to thinking. As a kind of, not an illustration, but an image to make this more concrete. No, this is also Michel Serres from a book which is called L'incandescent. So l'incandescent, so this means something, it's not burning or not burning, it has the capacity to lighten up. So it's like a potentia of light as matter. So incandescence. And he describes in it how from it's like a quantum physics view to biology. Yeah? So from a point of view of the genetic code, of the DNA, we incorporate traces of everything that has ever existed. Every rock, every mineral, every cosmic dust, everything. All the species. No, it's a completely different view to this power that the DNA would determine us. It's really the opposite. It lets us get lost in an oceanic body. It's very surprising. I mean, it's like when we say that our DNA is to, I don't know how much it is, 95% identical with the ones of chimpanzees. And then we are humans with this 2% divergence or something like that. So there is a huge pool, let's say, of contingent information that materially makes up who we are, and we have no relation to it. So what he writes here is, my brain is composed of ancient parts, reptilian, of others as new as those chimpanzees or bonobos would develop, and then further with parts that are incomparably much more recent. As such, my DNA appeared, of course, with the conjunction of my parents who built it, as one shuffles cards. But in its own structure, it is more than 3 billion years old, even older still. The atoms that compose both it and me go back to the fabrication of hydrogen and carbon from the galactic energy of the universe. I think this sounds mythic and of huge dimensions, but there is something extremely literal about this. No? So the natural sciences, they all start by identifying the date of a thing, starting from the age of the universe. It's about, today's estimation is about 14 billion years. Then the age of the different galaxies, the suns, the Earth, then the main steps of evolution on the Earth, the appearance of species, the disappearance of species. All of these things are marked through attributing it an age. It's so and so old. Such and such many years ago, this happened. And this identification in time, this dating, this is the starting point for analytical interpretations. And what Searle proposes, and I'm very fond of this idea, is to say, well, now there is maybe a possibility to think about the qualitative, the intensive materiality of time through data in relation to age. So this idea that the light actually has a materiality, it is not that new. No? So he was actually one of the teachers of Immanuel Kant. He was called Lambert. And he wrote a treatise where he began to introduce architectonics, a term that primarily was very much related to basically either whether you have an allegorical or geometrical or whatever kind of understanding of what mathematics does. And he said, no, from this mathematics we can derive means of measuring the physics of light. He called this photometria, and the photometria is what he called architectonics. Kant took this term from Lambert and said, yes, but we cannot stay within nature, we wouldn't be critical, yes? So then this domain of a kind of a physical power of light became transformed in the idea of what then evolved as phenomenology. So it's an energetic state of phenomena. So, and phenomenology wasn't properly part of Kant's system, it was something like a prolegomena too. Now, and this inverted with German idealism, so there is a whole story to it, but what got forgotten for 200 years, most, or even more, is this idea of the photometria, because it was a mathematics to actually address the physics of light, and there was no use for that. There was no application for that until physical renderers in theory. Yeah. So when they started to develop these programs, Lambert's text was the one that they would actually go back to. So very interesting. But then if we say there is a physics that can be treated like this, so what would be a notion of nature that relates to it? And as I keep saying, I'm not interested in mystifying things. Yeah? So if you have a notion of measurement with regard to nature, there must be principles. No? If every natural law turns into a law of conservation, there must be a mechanical principle in the back. And I think we can think today about this principality through, on the one hand, nuclear fission, and on the other hand, photosynthesis, as two substitutes for one and the same principle. And they are inverse to each other. They're a bit like Peirce's continuity, no? Between mind that is very fast matter and matter that is very slow mind. So we have photovoltaics and nuclear fission as inverses with regard to each other. And if we think about the principality like this, then we can get scales for tempering their relation. And this is something very interesting. It's again related to this idea in the meteora, with regard, of course, to how do we address the questions of sustainability, how do we address the ecological challenges that are so predominant today. And we don't have a proper framework to address that, because there is no healthy balance. Wow, how could we identify that? There are so many scales. to a possible balance. So how can we identify that? And the beauty of such an idea with thinking these two poles, but it's not really poles like North and South Pole, it's more like, yeah, like a center, no, the nuclear would be in the center and the photovoltaics is on the surface. I'm not sure how to address that, but this kind of spectrality is that it can operate, we can learn to think with it, independent of making decisions what should be the scale, what should be the relevant scale for identifying balances. So that is the classic scientific neutral or distanced stance. Yeah? So science and morals must be decoupled, otherwise we lose science. There is no science if science reproduces morals. That's why Serre was saying we recognize ideology today through the use of calendars. So what does this mean for a field like ours with regard to theory and architecture? It means that a kind of a historiographic approach to identifying modern periods at all, and then modern, so in a linear way, which would somehow position the digital as the contemporary age now at the end, as quite uninteresting. Because what the digital proposes to us, what we learn through the digital, is mathematics. It's not properly related in our time. It's more creating a kind of a space, a phased space of synchronized possible durations, I would call them. I will come back to the term of durations. It's important for this intensive notion of time. And as we could describe this, what the digital gives us is maps through knowledge, and these maps, they're not properly territorial, but they make up a kind of a continentality. They give us an atlas of the world in the sense of having, no, it's like atlas in myth, so you have a point in the outside and you can move weights that are disproportionate to what you are actually yourself. And that's, in a way, quite what the Anthropocene names. No, the Anthropocene says we are living now in an age where we recognize that human life on Earth actually impacts on a geological scale the nature of the planet. So this is quite like an atlas. And there are, I mean, Michel Serre is not the only one who is trying to address this. Other theorists, philosophers, some of them who try to get there, of course, is Bruno Latour, who is very much inspired by Michel Serre, but I very much recommend you not. If you're interested in Serre, don't read Latour. Read Michel Serre. And then the notion of the fourfolds, of course with Heidegger, and then with Harman, with the object-oriented turn, but also the figure of the double articulation. No? With this that we have the two things that are somehow the same. I call them substitutes of one at the same point, center. These two things that somehow there is not a one-way relation between them, but they mutually bring each other into being. This is a principle that was central for Hiemslev, with his idea in linguistics of double articulation. It was from the 20s, 30s. It's the core theory with which all of Deleuze's theory is working. And what it changed, what Hiemslev had changed, was that he was not looking for a structure or a system to describe language. He was saying, within language there is always an algebra at work. Yeah? So we need an algebra in order to identify a system or a structure. He says, there is an algebra at work and language is alive. So we would never get a positive, comprehensive, exhaustive account of a language, but we get instruments to live within language in a reflected and in a precise kind of manner. It's the beauty of Hiemslev. And also here, I love Deleuze and Guattari very much, but if you're interested in this, read Hiemslev, not them. So, this way of thinking about time is something very, very old. Like I said, with the Meteora. So this is not the next thing that is invented now. At its core is a device that is central to when we think about where is form actually coming from? Where is geometry? How is it possible that we have this enormous abstract precision that form gives us, that geometry gives us? How is it that circles and triangles and lines and points and squares and angles and cones and so on, that they can do so much? Because it is with forms, ultimately, that we can live in a world as fly to the moon and come back. This is with mathematics, so it's invented, it's all made up, and yet it's there and it works. Yeah. So where is this coming from? And with regard to that, there is this device of the sun clock that is very central. It was called the gnomon, and all of the terms that you have in mentality, so that means also in augmentation, that means in automation, all the things that relate to a kind of a cognitive process, they all come from the same root of mens, which is constitutive for the gnomon. So the gnomon was a device that would be the objective intelligence that knows and indicates. And that's because the gnomon is simply a stick standing in the sun, but because the sun moves circular, there is a regularity that could be extracted from having reference points. No? So the rise of the sun and the decline of the sun, and on an astronomical level, this would connect to the 2 points in a year when day and night are equally long. They're called solstice and equinoxes. So when the course of the sun turns around and when day and night are equally long. So there is a kind of a balance that doesn't mean anything, but it does a lot. Yeah, and the gnomon is it's the one device, and I explicitly don't call it a tool because it has not really a purpose other than recording data, but not for a specific thing. But it gives us ways to delineate shadows. And delineating shadows means we are no longer directly describing the things themselves. We have a distance that is not involved with it in a space that doesn't exist. So we are in abstraction. So the huge step that triggered a lot of the explosions, we could say, with the ancient Greeks, was that they abstracted from the idea of the gnomon. So the gnomon was not some kind of mystical, magically working device. They thought about how it works. And what they did is they related to it in a manner where they would stop time and open up a projective space of one moment that is globalized. No? The moment at noon when the sun is in a straight angle, and they would start to do experiments with the shadows and the gnomons in this abstract space that doesn't exist. It's entirely projective, but within it we can think mechanics. So we can projectively invent processes, plan and draw processes, mechanical processes with simple figures that give us ideas of what we could actually realize in mechanics. So this was a huge thing. But what remains is that the gnomon is always related to thinking of time in terms of durations. So it's always cyclical. So there are things which are periodical. There are phases with regard to it. There is not a line that would proceed moment to moment and add up and somehow grow heavier and heavier and heavier. There is a new morning all the time. So the time that they are concerned with is a time, and that's also how it was used before the theoretical abstraction, to learn about cultivating a fertile ground. So the main, in many cultures, way back behind the Greeks, early geometry and astronomy basically translated into agricultural wisdom, no? into knowledge about how to make the earth fertile, how to achieve produces, how to live better, and so on. So there is a relation between a kind of to a ground, but it's a ground that is indefinitely rich, if you want. And we can think of the projective plane of the time which is frozen in theoretical geometry as the same kind of fertility. And then we have a reference point to think about the history of mathematics in a different way than one which just can be graphed as a gradual progressing line that would get more and more true, or something like that. So that also means within mathematics there is thought. Mathematics is not, it is objective, it is entirely impersonal. That's the big thing about mathematics. No, it doesn't matter who you are or in which time you are living or where in the world you are living, it's always producing the same thing. Yeah, so it's not subjective in the sense of a personal relation. And yet, if there is history to it, then there must be a kind of a subjectivity. And it is this subjectivity that I want to address as a body of thinking that is always organized in the mathematical knowledge of a certain time, to understand its translations, its manifestations in the devices. What this also means is that notions like quantities, like units, like numbers, like elements should be addressed as a kind of a black box. Black boxes which are not entirely elucidated. We are not entirely, so we cannot really explain why and how mathematics works, not if we want to stay in a scientific manner of thinking, only if we go to religion or if we go to ideology, or to any particular doctrine, but not in principle. And what is very beautiful with this mythical, I call it mythical content, is that we can then relate theory, which relates to seeing and projecting, no, in this artificial after stopping time, no, outside of time. The theory domain is related to an acoustic domain of harmonics. And the big difference is that in harmonics, in acoustics, we always go around corners. Yeah? So in acoustics, no, you cut out angles. So you are within the circle that is self-referential, and yet you take out some irrational magnitude. So you have angles. Whereas with theory, in principle, you always proceed through the line. So you linearize. And what is beautiful if we say there is thinking in mathematics and in every and the other way around, is that it's not either or. The whole point is that their relation with regard to each other, it's like photosynthesis and nuclear fission, or like matter in purse. They co-evocate each other. So it completely means that harmonics doesn't. This is not saying we find the original harmony and we need to re-establish it. No, harmonics is a mathematical theory. Basically, it's arithmetic. It's a number theory. So harmonics doesn't mean that things are harmonious. Yeah, it doesn't mean that, but it means that the different scales can be brought to relate to each other. And how they can be brought to relate to each other, this is the core idea of what I call the cornucopian instruments. I will come back to them in a moment. First, so we need know if information is this oceanic body, if there is this plurality of scales. If whatever we can identify as a dimension just decouples and can be coded and set apart, we are in a huge whirlwind. Yeah? So things are way too complex. There is way too much of everything. And then rather than trying to trace the lines, or to make some lines go away in order to control very few ones which stay, which is how we mainly relate to information today. We want to purify, we need to reduce, we need to be hygienic with regard to it. But what we can learn from the Baroque gesture is that if it is possible to stop time, like the Greeks did, to maintain an orthogonal position within what I call the scenographic confusion, the scenographic vortexes of sense-making and of descriptions and of offers of graphical representations, if we can have a kind of an orthography, and that means we must know what ground are we relating to, so what kind of an ethnography, things start to circle. If they start to circle, we have pattern, we have periodicity. No? We don't need, if we are all of our information technology is circular. So electricity is circuits. We have frequencies, we have periods, we have phases, we have magnitudes for these circuitous stuff. Yeah, that can play on many scales. So we have a kind of we need to have a kind of an instrument in order to do that. And this instrument, I would like to suggest, it's of course it's a mythical proposal, but the little thing that I keep putting on every slide, now this is a kind of a phase space for an instrumentality that doesn't yet exist. So it's the cornucopian instrument in terms of what it is supposed to do. It's a bit like a generalized typography. No? That's why I called it scenography. This is from an exercise that they are doing at ETH. They're parsing, so one of the exercises is to parse, I don't know, 50 main newspapers, worldwide newspapers every day, and to just assemble all of the news in one document where every typography, every organization is abstracted from. Of course, this is creating a kind of a data structure to work with, but the effect that I'm interested in is that news are so boring. If you take away the whole dramatization that we are used to, if all this information of what a piece means, if it is here or there, if it has a header like this, if it is like that or that or that, even so, it's very shocking. A lot of the things, of course, no, I mean, how can, it's very unethical to say that news are boring, but try it out. Yeah? So there is an important role to typography, there is an important role to the dramatization of content. That becomes very striking if we actually work with a lot of data. I don't say big data, that's a thing for itself. But it's a very interesting experience, and it gives a different way to think about parsing. Parsing is a beautiful word in principle. No, it says to state the parts of speech in a sentence. But of course, the problems that the linguists always have is we need parts of the speech in order to identify sentences, but we also need a sentence in order to identify parts of the speech. So it's always the same cycle. But if we can parse, means we code possible understandings of that, so we can open up different scales. So we are building cornucopian instruments. And we can test them empirically. So we can test them with regards to a lot of data of things that we already have a familiarity with. Yeah. So this is not about finding new things. This is much more about unlocking things in everything that exists. So the idea is here, it's a strange mixture. It's almost like a conservative progress or a progressive conservativeness. No? But it's coming from the cycle, no? Because so it's progressing, but it's regressing at the same time. Everything that is cyclical is progressing also through regressing. So we cannot apply dialectical thought to this. That is not directly, at least. That is very, very interesting. And again, this is not something very new. So there is especially one text that I'm very fond of by Paul Valéry. It's entitled Eupalinos or the Architect. And Eupalinos was, I mean, that probably would be a discussion in itself, because he was, or usually is, understood as an engineer rather than an architect. Because what he did, nevertheless, was something super astonishing. He built for the first time, at least of what we know, a tunnel of 1 kilometer through, starting from both sides at the same time and actually meeting. Yeah, this is incredible. How can that be done? So it's quite a thing. So it's a big figure, Alcalinos. And that's a little bit what this text by Valéry is about. So it's a dramatic text. It imagines Socrates and Phaedra, and I'm not sure anymore what the other characters are and if. But the main plot is this, that Socrates is standing at the border of the ocean, and a thing gets, what is the word, angeschwemmt, delivered in front of his feet, and this thing is clearly of regular form, but it is clearly nothing that he could link to anything that he knows. So it's the paradox, how can there be form, how there can be regularity of something that is new, that doesn't just qualify as a different variation of a thing that we have. So it started, or at least it was a very central kind of contribution to the discussion on aesthetics. Now, how is it even, how could it even be possible to understand or to perceive something with which we are not at all familiar? And what role does form play in this? So it was, the scandal that Valéry introduced in this piece is, of course, that Socrates didn't want to know anything about it and threw it back into the sea. Okay. So, and it became a kind of a theme which was very important then in aesthetics. But it developed in a way where aesthetics or art almost comes to compete with science. No, it's as if either you can be perceptive and aesthetically sensible, but then don't try to rationalize it, or you are rationalizing things and you're like stumpfsinn, aesthetically speaking. So it's a kind of a strange polarity which I find not at all convincing, nor beautiful, nor interesting, especially with regard to the digital. because it's somehow asking the question that is central to mathematics always. No, what is a nothing? So, what is a nothing? So to encrypt something, all of algebra that we know has at its core notions the zero, and the zero is an articulation of something which is not there, or of a nothing, which would mean something even larger than a thing which is not there, not just absence. So what is a nothing? So encryption, cryptography, these are the most, that's why we have the two, they're like archetypes, no, in architecture, the labyrinth and the crypt. The labyrinth, that Jumi wrote this beautiful text about the two, the labyrinth or the crypt. With crypt we have a kind of a sensuous embodiment which is massive, and with the labyrinth we try to flee all the time and we completely get lost. No? But the two are actually what always plays together in mathematics. And the beauty of Valerie's text is then, of course, to say, well, there is something about abstraction and about creativity that he wanted to address, which has something to do with dance and the soul. So this was the subtitle of his book, which is not here now. That's how he tries to not play the architect versus the philosopher. No? But to say there's a kind of a dance involved where all of the aspects of aesthetics play together. So, another reference point that you might perhaps be more familiar with Deleuze is this beautiful passage, I think it's on his book on Beckett, on exhaustion. No? So with Deleuze it's always, there are so many territory-claiming proposals of how to make sense of this notion of the virtual. And I think here it becomes, at least in the understanding that I find the convincing one in Deleuze, and also the beautiful one in principle, and quite clear. So it's a passage where he says, to be exhausted is a whole lot more than tired. It is not just tiredness, I'm not just tired in spite of the climb. The tired no longer prepares for any possibility, this would be subjective. He therefore cannot realize the smallest possibility, this would be possibility in an objective sense. But possibility remains, because you never realize all of the possible. You even bring it into being as you realize some of it. The tired has only exhausted realization, while the exhausted exhausts all of the possible. The tired can no longer realize, but the exhausted can no longer possibilitate. So what we have here is a kind of an interplay. So to be imaginative means we need to be exhausted. But if we are exhausted, we are no longer moving within the domain of the possible, because the possible can always be counted. No, this is possible, this. We can build a sum and call it potentia, but it doesn't help. So we are no longer moving within the possible, because we are unlocking different things from that which has already been realized. And this is, I think, the power of imagination, at least that I'm interested in with this materiality of light that I started with. And I think, at least in many ways, it has a lot of resonances to what Deleuze was interested in when he said, we need to relate the virtual to the real, not to the possible. No, we need to relate the virtual to the actual. No? And the actual would be the actuality within the real, so the activity of the materiality of it. So then, but how to do that? And it's again, how much? I'm already talking for a long time. No? Am I fine?
You still have a little bit left.
So we can think of, we don't need to invent these instruments from scratch. We can think of a lot of the methods that we actually know in mathematics as them. So when we think of the method of exhaustion or of analysis through a method of exhaustion, which doesn't presuppose a particular definition of number, to give itself logical foundation, but it just somehow works. Then we can vary. We can learn to do absurd things like squaring the circle, or placing circuits in a square. We will see this is what a duration is, if you think about it. The duration, something has a certain time. This is like placing something circuitous, a circuit, in a reasonable rational space, so in a rectangle. So to think very abstractly on such transfigurations. And what one would be doing with that is to formulate hypotheses in order to mobilize them. So a hypothesis, we always say we don't want to be dogmatic, but dogmatic is only a problem if there's only one doctrine which says I'm the only one. But as long as there are different schools that know that they are schools, so that they know they have certain presuppositions, which are not necessarily to be accepted, then dogma is not really something so bad. So a hypothesis, in order to become more general, so to inspire more things, must be coded and placed somewhere. There must be structure with regard to a hypothesis in order to become doxa. That's again the same sense that I mean with a kind of a containment, so formality as a kind of a containment by black boxes. So then, if we have no geometry or theory and harmonics, they are not competing, they're playing together. We can say wherever from a linear, from a theoretical perspective, we have a paradox. No? We actually have we can say from the harmonic perception, no, in this paradox we have an absurdity. And an absurdity means something that sounds from the bottom, absurdus. So it's coming from, it's a sound that can be perceived. It's a bit like the people who, you were speaking of this movie before we came here, no? With capturing the signals from space for finding aliens and so on. So it has to, picking up frequencies that were not properly dimensioned before. It doesn't mean they were not there, but they were not meaningful. So we can relate. It's not either absurd or paradox. Paradox if you're a logicist, and absurd if you're a romantic. No, you can actually combine the two and play with it. And then such playing needs, of course, a kind of an identification with it. So that's why I started with the book by Hanke. So the notion of authorship, of authority, I think is getting again very interesting in our time. It's not enough, as the post-structuralists did, no, to say that the reader is now the author and these kinds of structuralist inversions. The point is that they sediment, so they become the basis of something more that proceeds. So there is not only, it's not only about describing a plane, it's about capturing an eventuality that happens through time on a plane that is dispositioned in a certain way. So this I want to call the signature of the architect, and it has a lot to do with saying nothing in particular. No? But this, so it's like when you are a mechanic, you don't really want to make a decision. You want something to be preserved in how it can be achieved. You don't usually, if you're, that's why mechanics was always until the 18th century an art. Now we treat mechanics as if it was the most boring thing, because there is no creativity involved in mechanics. Everything is determined. But if you think mechanics not from the systematic point of view of the classical science, but from a craft kind of view, I would say a literacy point of view through instruments, then it's something super interesting. And again, it's not about now inventing mechanics that doesn't exist or to find the next thing. It's about looking at what is there through this different point of view. The notion of modularity becomes very interesting. So what a cipher does, if we articulate nothing into a cipher, what we get is a code, and the code is just like the module in Wiederoof's architecture theory. So you have a kind of a ground magnitude from which all the magnitudes with which you want to work are being derived. So it's a cipher and articulating nothing. A cipher gives you a kind of a module with which you can open up a systematical space, but it's one that is more like a spectrum in quantum physics. So now we can have of the same kind of light, we can have many spectra, and they don't contradict each other, just as little as the violin and the contrabass contradict each other. They're different, but they're treating the same, and this difference is not one of positive and negative. It's relative to scales, and the scales must be brought to play together in a certain way. So the idea, again, which was central in modernity, and of course much earlier as well, I think even Wiederoop was one of the first who spoke explicitly about an encyclopedia, so to play wisdom or knowledge or truth within the circle. So that this is what he's interested in with theory. So to place it within the circle. And the problem always was, well, but this placement within a circle, it affects somehow what tries to be conserved through it. And that is a line of thinking, and that's again a proposal by Michel Serre. He calls it a chronopaideia. So we shouldn't try to place all the knowledge, all the wisdom in one circle, but in chronos, so in counted time. So this, the knowledge that can be understood, we can place it in the durations, like when you know every mechanism, when you know how to achieve something and how to undo it. You're capturing time, you're preserving time, and you're creating, it's like Thales when he stopped time with the gnomon and said everything now relates to the moment when the sun is at noon, at the highest, and to the projective space that we can yield from it. And then our ways to relate to the bottom, to the ground, to the walls, to the ceilings, to almost everything that plays a role in space, articulation of space, doesn't really become something entirely different, but it starts to be interesting in a different way. And again, so, and this kind of finding new resonances, so finding new ways of being rhythmical with something, which is a black box, which is mysterious, but we don't really want to know ultimately its mystery, its mysteriousness. We just want to learn to talk to it, we want to coexist. It's almost like when we meet people, I don't really want to know. No, not that much. I want to, so at least not immediately. Yeah, so it's a kind of talking to each other to get to know, to get familiar. Not taking into possession through claiming to know exhaustively. So, and this I call, so this kind of learning to talk to things in a precise, in a formal way. This is what I would call a cornucopian instrument. And for example, it's like the bow and the violin. What they do is, they're manners of qualifying an absence. Or the surfer and the board, ships in the seas. And then, of course, the whole technology of the levers, of actually lifting, of making, if you think even an aqueduct, what it does is quite astonishing. It makes water come uphill. They can do that. Pumps too. It's completely against everything natural. We can do it. So this is what I mean. So placing things in chrono, in counted time. Placing things in counted time. It's not something that we should start doing now. It's what actually everything has always been about, if we are looking at it like that. But there's no need to. Yeah. So it's a kind of a new day. I take this image of Pasolini to stress very much that this is not about saying how the world can become harmonious. This is not an ethical theory of what will be goodness, ultimately. But there's also no reason to say nothing good can come tomorrow. Yeah? Let's keep it like that. That's, again, Peter Handke, this is Bildverlust. So what he tries to say, he says, but isn't there a kind of an energy to the absence of the picture? So that we don't have pictures anymore, and we don't have the capacity to imagine. We could say we are exhausted and we are tired. Yeah. So we are exhausted and we are tired. So he says, isn't there a kind of an energy proper to this? And this kind of energy, he says, it has something to do with love. So it's a way of intensive relating, but not one that, he writes, these pictures, they are always devoid of human beings and happenings, but they have to do with love, a kind of a love. And they have penetrated her, she is the author, and she is a banker. So she is the protagonist of this book is one of the most hateful characters that one could choose today. It's very interesting. They have penetrated her since childhood. Some days fewer of them, some days whole swarms of these shooting stars, always taking the form of something she had actually experienced in passing. It's an experience, but not a conscious experience. It's always something that happened to her without her noticing it. And they would give these images. Sometimes completely absent, a non-day. And she was convinced that this happens to everyone, to a greater or lesser extent. No doubt the specific image always belongs to the individual's world, personal world. But the image itself, as an image, was universal. It transcended him, her, it. By virtue of the open and opening image, people belonged together. And the images did not impose anything, unlike every religion or doctrine of salvation. Except that as yet no one had managed to tell the story of these images properly, had also not found this phenomenon as earth-shaking as she had also not found the courage. She certainly had not. The whole story that Hanke tells is that she tries to find a way of getting somebody to write her story for her. Yeah? And all that she can do is pay that person, but the person who wants to be paid for doing it couldn't do what she wants him to do. So this is the, in a line, the intricate thing that the story unfolds. As a way to say, okay, it's Earthrise, it's somehow at the end of the world, but we can, yeah. It's not it's the end of the world, for now. So we try in our work maybe to bring a little bit back of what that means, or what we could do with thought like this, with students. So I would like to give you two, three very few examples. So one thing we do is try to make the students, and this is very early, it's in actually the first semester, to write about something of which we can hardly say much. A table was the first object, the second one was the stairs. So it's such an abstract object that it's very, very hard to even say something about it. That takes more than, I don't know, 3-4 lines that would give some formulas or some measurement technical terms. And that's exactly what we want, of course, them to, what we want to trigger in them. We call these quantum words on architectonic objects. They are online. Right now they are writing on the stairs, on the Stiege. What is that? And I also invited friends, people I know, so philosophers, literature people, also carpenters, so very different people, all to write about these objects. And then I mix the best ones from the students with the ones that we get. We get a compilation to find somehow a code, an instrumental way to relate to an object that claims to have a certain objectivity, but not one without subjectivity. So the main thing is form. They are not graded according to having a good idea or not. They're graded entirely in terms of rhetorics and poetics and precision in thinking. So is it well crafted? And being well crafted, of course, gives them a space in which we can be involved in language, even so we are precise. So we must know about the different relations of passivity, activity, the declinations of things, so all of these things. That's also what we develop in a master course, which is called Substitute. So it's teaching basics in rhetorics and poetics and in mathematical thinking. And the way, so I put this picture here because it doesn't suit on the next slide, which is one of the pieces that one of the students wrote in this semester. We taught it for the first time. The task was they need to identify a building that they are somehow interested in. So it must be a strong building, whether they like it or whether they don't like it. It must be a strong building, and every week they need to address or to talk to it in a certain way. And through learning how to talk to it, learning the principle, the tools of rhetorics and poetics. So this is the building that this one student chose, and what he wrote, I think in the third week, this was very early, was this. I found it quite remarkable. So there the task was to choose a meter. So to mold his way of speaking to this building into a poetic meter that he doesn't know yet. And what came out was he crafted a rhythmical piece, which was not entirely, so it's interesting. He wrote, "It were your eyes that made mine wonder. I looked at yours and you at mine. I could but wonder what made them this brute, or is it resolute? Deeper than my thoughts could reach. They are, I looked upon, but not into, could not reach from afar, but when I blinked, your blinds did not. And fear erupted in me, for I could not see what you are, nor who you'd be, if only I could see. Your body, shards of stone combined, entwined in dance, slow and ever slower, as if savoring a moment, a pause, waiting for applause. Yet continue you would not, this dance, so there must be no need, no urge, no chance, no gain for you in any of such movements. Nothing matters but these moments, and you stand as you would ever, and I looked as I had never. Cold, I thought you to be, no light, no hope in me, no life, no joy, not even smile would you. From far away you'd stay, apart. That we are, I'd say. But then it dawned on me, if only I could see, a little closer, just a wee. What happens next? We'll see. So he was talking to that building, and he chose one that he didn't like. This, of course, made it interesting. It's much, much harder if you choose a building that you do like. But there is another example. He liked that building very much, and it's also very beautiful. What he wrote, it captures a mood. No? It's about capturing the way of how we relate emotionally to the things, without becoming, I mean, that's the trick, or the challenge, without becoming pathetic. And it's meter which helps a lot. It's form and meter which helps a lot. So what he wrote, this is a kindergarten in Japan. We live together, all of you and me. I was shaped and still am every day. I give you flow, you make it written. When there is more of you, my head swirls, round and round and round. We are open, you and me, because you are, I can be too. I like your stories, the ones you're writing on mine. When we meet, I'm full of joy. I guess you are too, you're smiling. So it doesn't need to have a consequence. It doesn't need to have a kind of a catastrophe or a violence in order to be metrical and to be interesting in how it is articulated. So this is the thing. We don't, like the story with the news, the drama always makes everything so drastic. But there can be dramatization to things that are much more aesthetic, we would say, with Voltaire's piece, perhaps. These are some of the references of where all of this thinking is coming from. You were very kind in saying in the beginning, but I don't think anybody knows our books actually. At least they don't sell very well. But of course I have. So,
Because you give them away via PDF, right?
yeah, of course. So this was it. Thank you very much.
As always, again, time for questions. So you can let it sink a little bit in, but then maybe something pops up.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I don't think that I understood everything, but I think there's a question nevertheless. I was thinking about the theoretical implications of what you're doing and presenting, because at the beginning you talked about post-structuralism and how this kind of departs, and about new materialism and how this departs. Now, when I think about new materialism, it has a certain connection to feminism and to the meta-materiality, embodiedness, Barat meta-meaning, heroin situatedness. So this is how I understand new materialism. And there's of course a critique or criticism about about mathematics and abstraction. This is what you said basically. But then I was wondering if you want to find or present a way of thinking in mathematics that changes the reference, so it's not mass, it's light, it's different.
Or it's the same thing.
Yes.
Light and mass from quantum physics point of view, but sorry.
But you're looking, if I understood correctly, there is some attempt to escape this fixed reference, to open up thinking, and yet there's a reference, and then the reference is formed and written in circularity. So how can novelty or creation or invention happen, and what are the ethical implications of understanding matter in a way that is still very abstract in a way? So why mathematics? Why not embodiedness? Why not a different way of thinking about matter?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you very much for bringing. Maybe it helps me to, because the way that I want to think of mathematics is an embodied way. That's the thing. So there's a body of thinking But this is not an individual body, and it doesn't come into an ontology of different species, but it's a body of thinking. And it's underlying is the assumption, of course, that there is what this epistyle period always describes. No? There is something that is common to the phenomena in a certain time range. And the question is how to address this. That's what I'm interested in. And when I hated mathematics. I really, truly was not interested in mathematics for a very long time. Until actually in media studies, I tried to finish my PhD, and I started to realize that, they say the medium is a universal, the computer is a universal medium, so a medium is no longer specific, it becomes generic, but then if it's generic, it's not a medium, it's a black hole. And so then it swallows up every kind of differentiation and distinction that there is. And then I realized that the precise terms to relate to this mediality is actually algebra, and that all the programming languages are algebra, and algebra is always tautology. Algebra is an equation, so A equals L, it's a tautology. But if you factorize, so if you say, I don't know what A is, yeah, you can be almost like alchemist. So it's not by chance that magic and alchemy and all of these miraculous things, they would always work with formulas. Because formulas are an algebraic way of saying. And then I started to realize this. And then my teachers, when I did my PhD, didn't like this at all. No, they would just say, wow, mathematics, we are not competent, we don't know. And I certainly wasn't competent. And then it was my chance that I met these people from ETH who were interested in addressing the logistic network. So not networks as topology or some structure, or as systems, as biological organisms or something like that, but as logistics. So points that facilitate movement in a complex way. And then I started to work with them, and I gradually could develop the basic mathematical understanding of addressing mediality. And then I could complete my PhD, and then I wanted to know more. And then I realized that Peirce, from whom I had loved precisely for being material with regard to language, was an algebraist. So then I started to read all the mathematicians in the 19th century, not the historians who tend to explain it today. Read what they were saying, not the formulas. No, you can trust if somebody is important, you can trust that they didn't make big mistakes in the formulas. But you can read what they wrote about what they were thinking that they are doing as a way of trying to express something that you don't exactly know what it is. And it's beautiful, it's very interesting, it's deeply philosophical. And then if you get a kind of a stability before the foundation crisis, if you really want to, you can look at the foundation crisis. But it's very, I mean, of course, that's what ultimately one needs to understand. But it is crucial for understanding about the computer. But there's something very interesting. You started with the gender, no? with the mathematics as this masculine and the kind of a sensual approach, more feminine manner of being situational in thinking. Of course, ultimately the beauty of this approach is that the two are not, so it's like North Pole and South Pole, they're not opposites. So they open up kind of a spectrality. I'm personally very much, I mean, when I studied literature, gender was of course very, very important. I was very much informed through the structuralist and the post-structuralist and the feminist discourses. But I always liked the idea of the androgynous mind, which in the Woolf, for example. I always liked that. And this is an idea that translates into this materiality. So the whiteness of this light contains any color. Yeah? And it can only be addressed through the dark, through the shadow, so through the other pole of it. So but I haven't worked on this. I'm talking a lot about this with my few friends I have in the new materialist networks, because it's exactly what you are saying. So there are a lot of people in the new materialism that are super allergic to this. They really don't want mathematics. But there must be ways to translate how it can work. That's more or less what I can say. So it's not either structure or form. It's not either topology or geometry. It's not either arithmetics or harmonics. It's never. Wherever we have the duality, we don't need to think the either or. And that is just enormously beautiful and promising. But we need to have literacy in it. And And this literacy then, it's neither mathematics nor, because we need both, language or poetics and mathematics, and that's why I call it the quantum literacy. But that's also not a term that people tend to respond very affirmatively. But I want to try a bit longer. What questions?
I mean, we talked before just briefly, and maybe I just throw it out so that everybody can be part of it. But we just briefly start, I addressed that maybe our school, in particular, through the body of teachers which we had in the past, had a certain affinity to language. Not all of them, but had a certain affinity to language, but in a very particular way. How they were talking about language or how they were even using language. And I believe in one of your previous lectures you even take a quote of Peter Eisenman or an abstract out of, I don't remember exactly the publication that you referred to, but there was a very kind of specific approach, I think, to language in the 60s, 70s, 80s, like, right? Which for architecture or for, let's say, formally driven practices kind of ended up in this generative formalism, kind of, right? So I wonder what your thoughts on that would be, and how you are trying to unlock language in a different way.
Yeah, so I try to, that's why I try to set apart not just this level of information or the infinity of numbers, but then even only the necessary finitude of the vocabulary, but of course the language is, so they're all that forms, so it's not there either. But to speak about that in a way that doesn't presuppose a notion of systematicity. So the thing is to decouple exhaustiveness from consistency. This is now in the charm of the analytical philosophy. So the problem that Goethe stated is that we cannot describe a system in a way that articulates its consistency and that exhaustively represents what it is capable of. The two don't coincide. And what I'm proposing is this kind of link. That's why I did because logics would need systematicity in the way where it convenes. But literacy is technical, it's mechanical, so it's formal, it's objective, but it's creating covering spaces. It's not trying to represent the nucleus or the essence of something. It's an affirmative way of creating black boxes, but not because one wants to be obscurative. Precisely not. But it's because ultimately the things cannot. So at least from now we can call it white light, or you can call it nuclear energy or something like that, but it doesn't help us aesthetically, sensibly. It doesn't make sense. I mean, we have a huge problem in the 20th century, that the abstractness of our technology, we really don't have imaginations with regard to it. We don't. So people don't know anything about it. Don't know about very, very basic changes with networks with regard to systems, or the difference between logics and logistics, or that with electronics, you cannot describe objectively. You go either for the position or for the extension. You cannot teach this. So the basic ideas of epistemology don't work. And then we can say, but we don't like quantum physics, it's so abstract, and whoever. No, the electro-engineers, they work with it because they produce the tools, but we don't need to relate to it. And I really don't think, I think this is fatally wrong. So we need to, when we have these problems of, the research agendas in universities, they all focus on very fewer and fewer super drastic problems. Almost every project needs to make a contribution to saving, pollution, to sustainability, or to translate very practically into problems of the order of what I call world objects. So it's completely disproportionate that some coffee cup should do that. But it has to do then with the scenography, so with keeping attention, of course, for things that are important. So I don't want to expose this as illusion. The point is that
the space of this illusionariness matters. But then within it we cannot claim to be epistemologists. We cannot claim to be uninvolved. So we are sophists. So what? No? The philosophers would never have been possible without the sophists, who were tremendously important in wresting the authority with regards to knowledge from religious sacrality. So from the priests and the people who had, through political systems, the authority to speak. So it was a hugely democratizing effect, and in my perception, what we experience in all of the 20th century is a new sophistics, and not in a pejorative sense. So it's about learning. It's like learning to have a Körpergefühl, no? A sense of what is that? Körpergefühl.
Body awareness.
Body, it's very esoteric. It's just a proprioception, I think that's it. Proprioception. So we're learning to develop proprioception. But what is important is that this is dangerous, no? Because the proprioception of the body of thinking that we are learning to develop a feeling for, it's a super hugely powerful one. But it always has been. So I don't think this is very new or super catastrophic compared to times in history. No, it's just on a new scale, which matches with the new scale of abstractness of our body of thinking. So, I mean, even when we read, I start to read now the notebooks, for example, of Marcel Duchamp. This is all about quantum physics. So completely different from the reception of a modern interest in form. At least I have never encountered this from art historians. Just really not. But it's everywhere. So to reread these things and try to relate to it, because we know a lot about that. And it's not going to be wrong only because we think more abstractly about it. It can help us to develop imaginaries. So, but it's not so much about finding a new thing. So, and the relation, what I proposed with nuclear physics and photosynthesis, because they would be the principles behind this, the body of thinking that corresponds to the electricization. And they're not either wrong or good or bad or false, but they can temper each other. They can temper each other. I mean, an entirely sustainable life cycle means that nothing can happen. No? But curation, like in agriculture, always means taking care of and challenging force at the same time. So it's a question of balancing. But it's not a balancing where we could represent or restore an original harmony. So the interest in language is one of the sophisms. So it's all the things. It's cosmetics, it's mannerism, it's meter. I mean, this student, no, he's not he wasn't the one whom I read first. It sounds so antique, almost. No, who writes poetry like that today? But it really helped him to develop a relation to this word resolute. He brought this word resolute, which is not a usual word. And the meter helped him to develop a feeling for what it could be. So this is interesting. These are the things I'm interested in. And we can call it aesthetics, but for me, it wouldn't be possible without having this relation of to an objectivity, to a formality, to an anonymity. So if these were the feelings that he personally has about the appearing, I'm not very interested, honestly. I'm interested if he captures to articulate something which also helps me to grasp my way of relating. It's not about finding the consensus, but it's about evocating resonances. So it's about feinfühliger. So not stumpfsinniger, feinfühliger. Mathematics can make us feinfühlig, not just stumpfsinnig. We can do that too.
My question might be super stupid, right? I'm sorry for my language. I'm not a theoretical researcher. So actually, you are wrong. I have one of your books. Actually, one of the first books I bought when I started my PhD research is The Coding as Literacy. And I have to admit, I was expecting a very, very different lecture today because I haven't visited any of your lectures yet, but I've been visiting like briefly following the seminar you had in your institute with Michael Boyle, and also I went to one of the presentations when the Square Hall staff brought some of his or your PhD students in PH or something. So, and today I was really expecting a lot of self-organizing maps and stuff.
Yeah. But it's all about self-organizing.
Yeah, that's what I actually,
That's the
for me, it was
instrument,
kind
of
of an
course.
introduction because until now, I think now kind of this lecture helped me to say like, okay. Yeah. And this was actually what I wanted to ask you. So as like from the coding and literacy, I took a lot from Musawi's, your colleague Musawi's writing. So actually, this was what I wanted to ask you. So all about, I want to go back, reflect back to this drawing with the cycle and with the multiple dimensions, and where you were mentioning that actually when we stop at some point in this time and
This one?
no, back a lot more back. It's just a hand drawing with this one, yes. So as far as I understand here, that you mean is like there is with all these different dimensions of like not evaluating but explaining something, we can actually build relational maps rather than kind of describing it as a generic rule, right? So this is actually what you are aiming for and what you are also trying to move into with the self-organizing map and also this whole diacritic structure. Am I right?
Yeah, no, this is perfectly the right track. So the thing is, the self-organizing map, this was one of the instruments, let's say, that is, it's very abstract and it's a very, very powerful one. And it's super hard to describe what it can do. It's because every description is wrong. It's not a neural network, and yes, it is, of course, but it's not very useful. So it is all of these things because it addresses the relation between category and classes. So we don't, it's like the scales and the dimensions. The two fall apart. Yeah, so it's not that we need the categories first and then we can test whether if the classes match, whether the categories are right. It's just like we cannot be in a scale and then move within dimension and then say the dimensions are now natural. So this falls apart. That means it's a way where we can actually address what is truly the only meaning of bigness, no? In Koolhaas, I'm very sure, but also with regard to data, it means unstructured data. It means data. Now usually data is collected, and this has been so in Babylonia already, so pre-Greek. So you have an algorithm, you have a kind of a recipe of steps. You after this, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then you proceed a certain kind of stream, and it marks patterns in a table. So then you have the data tables which are relative to how you would proceed this algorithm. But there is an immediacy with regard to that. So that means initially the data is always structured relative to how it has been recorded. But once we mix up data from different recordings into a probabilistic space, then we have a mixture of all these, or if we want, all the instruments playing together without orchestration. So it's super noisy. It's not that there is, in the bigness of data, it's not that there is no forming. It's not something like magma. Precisely not. It's clamor. It's clamorously noisy because it has formality that is not compatible from so many different things. So this is bigness. And the self-organizing map is a very powerful thing because it allows us to learn to make sounds out of this clamor. But then these sounds, they're not true. And they're just one way of saying something. But we can calibrate it with what we perceive from it. So we can look at the data with regard to things that we already know, and then we see whether something makes more sense or not. It's like if you want to do research in Google, no? You need to ask. You need to be able to ask good questions. You're lost in a mess of information if you're not. But if you are, you can find incredibly fast, incredibly precise, and incredibly relevant information. So it's the same. And it can be applied because it's mathematical to anything at all. And yeah, Wahid Musavi is, I very much recommend, he gave a colloquium also where he translates this to machine learning in general. And it's online, it's on the YouTube channel of CRB. And it's also, it's giving, I'm not on the tech, so he's a systems engineer, so he really knows what he's talking about on the technical. I'm trying to create imaginary correlating. But I trust in the basic principles I have an appropriate understanding, because I'm always working with the people. His profile is different, we all say, why, this is algorithms. Algorithms doesn't mean, every cooking recipe is an algorithm. It's not a magical thing. It's not. It's just magical, like all of mathematics is magical, because we can, with a few constellations of numbers or forms or formula, you can actually do amazing things that you would never have expected. So yes, algorithms can do that too, but they're not different than mathematics, and they are always related. Algorithms always means you ontology, you mystify ontology. You know? So we say, wow, we can read the structure from the empirical data. But it's the structure which has been imposed in order to create the data. Yeah. So we need, that's why this image is important. So what we have basically is the bigness of the data, it's clambering and it's all swirling around your head, and then we are not, so we don't know where we are standing, so we don't know which line to follow, where to go. But that's only when you think of it in terms of algorithms. If we stop time and open up a projective space, which doesn't need to be true. No? The projective spaces in geometry, they don't represent anything. They just produce a moment of calm where we can take in something and study it and then push it out again. So it's an interior space of mind where we can think clearly, even if we are in the worst of necessities. And that's precisely why we need it. We cannot get rid of abstraction. It's beautiful.
Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you very much again. Thank you, everyone.